Hello, everybody. We're going to be taking a look today at the 1990s and the Clinton administration, really from about 1992 to 1995. We'll look at the economic, foreign policy, politics. In general, we'll take a look at Clinton and his background and how he became president of the United States. So the Clinton 90s are on the way. But before we do so, I want to make sure I take any questions from all of you. So anybody who has any questions, comments, or concerns as we begin our final week? All right, guys, so let's go ahead and jump in. We'll take a look at Clinton. We'll talk about his presidency, and we'll discuss the nature of the Clinton era. All right, so Clinton is essentially going to become president in 1992. And this is going to happen essentially during the election. Now, in 1992, the election had a variety of different choices. Americans could choose between the Republican George H.W. Bush, who had been president for 4 years prior and vice president for 8 years before that. Ross Perot, who was a relative newcomer who basically ran on what was called the Reform Party, and had one of the most successful third party runs in American history. I think he got a pretty good percentage of the vote, much more than what third parties usually do. Just to understand, third parties don't really win in the United States, at least not at the presidential level. They do potentially turn the tide for another party. So if enough Democrats go to the third party, then it can make the Republicans win, or vice versa. But as far as third parties, because the Democrats and Republicans have got a stranglehold on the cash and the legal and all the laws that are associated with campaigns, it's just not super likely that you're going to see a third party win in the near future. Now, I might eat my words on that. I mean, maybe things will change. Certainly, the American electorate is changing and always is. But usually the Democrats or Republicans will just swallow whichever important third party is, becoming popular, and then the two-party system continues to perpetuate. So, without further ado, Ross Perot does very well as a third-party candidate, but he never seriously challenges becoming president of the United States. We have Clinton, who's going to run for the Democrats, and although we've already talked about George H.W. Bush, I think it's important to talk about Clinton next. So, who was Bill Clinton? Well, Bill Clinton, although scandals have kind of tarnished his image today, when he first ran in 1992, he was very personable. He was a very good speaker. He had been a baby boomer. He did a very successful career. He had been a Rhodes Scholar. He had been, considered being a professional saxophone player. And he was very appealing to younger voters. One of the things that Bill Clinton did very early on was he used the mass medium of television to promote himself. Clinton was in his 40s when he was elected president, so that would have made him one of the youngest presidents ever elected. I don't think he was the youngest, but he was in there. And so he was able to court the youth vote much more effectively than other presidents have done. And I think that was one of the things that helped him to get elected. I remember him appearing on, for example, MTV, which most of you are like, MTV, does that even still exist? Well, I'm sure it does, but it was much bigger in the 80s and 90s when, it was really, if you were a kid, I remember even my parents told me that I couldn't watch MTV. Like I was banned to do so. So it was like this forbidden thing. That would go to my friend Jimmy's house and, we would watch, TRL or whatever was on at that time. But anyway, Clinton would appear. He would make these full appearances, and that, obviously to court the youth vote, and I think that resonated well with younger voters. In addition, Bill Clinton isn't going to be alone. William Clinton will also bring into the White House his wife, Hillary Clinton, who of course needs no introduction today. She's probably more famous than Bill is, at least in modern circles. She did have an unsuccessful presidential run. She was a senator from New York, but at the time she was just first lady. She'd been a successful lawyer. She had put aside her political aspirations to help her husband. And, I think, Hillary always kind of appeared to be tough and aggressive, whereas Bill was always kind of the more personable one. He was always the guy that you kind of, looked at as being the guy who was going to get deals done and that kind of thing. So I think in that regard, they were a power couple. And there were some issues that followed the Clintons into the White House, some hints of scandal. But ultimately in 1992, when the voters made their decision, they're going to vote for Bill Clinton. Now, why does George H.W. not get reelected? Well, although H.W. had had tremendous success with the Persian Gulf War, he had also made a proclamation when he first became president in 1988, read my lips, no new taxes. And this became very famous, particularly SNL. If you ever watched any of the old SNLs with Dana Carvey, Dana Carvey did a spot on Bush impersonation. And this became commonplace. Everybody remembered, Bush saying this. And of course, the latter half of his presidency, Bush raised taxes and cut jobs. And those were, I think, things that came back to haunt him because Clinton, basically advocated for a different direction. And Clinton was more articulate than Bush was, and ultimately was the better campaigner. And so Clinton ends up winning in 1992. So the thing about Clinton was that Clinton was not your archetypal liberal Democrat. Today, we're familiar with Democrats that tend to run a lot further left of center than what people did in the 90s. In the 90s, Clinton would probably today be more of a Republican than he was a Democrat. Many of his policies, like, for example, one of the first things that Clinton wants to take care of is welfare. So what you had was this concept in the 80s of the welfare mom, the lady who just has, cranks out a ton of kids so she doesn't have to pay taxes, and then basically just lives off government assistance her entire life. Whether that's true or not, the welfare queen that Reagan had presented, I don't know. I don't know of anybody that's lived that way, but it's not to say that it doesn't happen. Maybe you have relatives or people who do abuse the system, and I'm sure that there are people that do. But the Clinton administration essentially targeted this as one of their primary concerns, was to basically put limits on welfare, and that's what they ultimately did. First of all, they have a 2-year limit on welfare where you can only be on it consecutively for 2 years, and then tougher laws on deadbeat dads, people who weren't paying their child support. So these were issues that were more right of center, and I think that Clinton was more of kind of a conciliatory candidate, that he's going to work as much with Republicans as he does with the Democrats. It's not like today where you just stonewall the entire other party. Back then, there was a lot of cooperation between the parties, and Clinton is certainly a vessel for that. So this is how Clinton, I think, gets elected in 1992. Any questions on the election of William Bill Clinton? So one of the questions is on the Lewinsky scandal. We'll talk about it. I promise you this week that we will go into depth about what happened with Monica Lewinsky, but it hasn't happened yet. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself yet. All right, so here you can see the three candidates there. You can see, of course, Clinton winning a large percentage of the electoral vote, really about 68%, and the popular vote as well. So he pretty much decisively wins in 92. All right, so Clinton's presidency. One of the first issues that Clinton addresses, besides his welfare restrictions, are the issue of what we call don't ask, don't tell. So the original policy of the United States military, at least during the early years, was that homosexuals were not allowed in the military. If you were a lesbian or if you were gay, they just would not let you in. Now, what the Clinton administration does is, certainly, although they're probably in favor of allowing homosexuals into the military, they knew that Americans weren't ready for that in 1990. So they kind of reach a compromise course. A policy that we know of today is don't ask, don't tell. So what that basically means is, if you're a homosexual who wants to go into the military, you can do it. You just don't ever tell anybody you're homosexual. All right. You're not gonna be able to have a pride parade. You're not gonna be able to, put rainbows up in your bunk. All right. You essentially remain closeted while you serve in the United States military. And yes, you could be gay, but you can't let your superior officers know about it. Does everybody understand what don't ask, don't tell means? That if you're gay, we're not going to ask you, and don't tell anybody. And that's essentially what don't ask, don't tell means. And that's the basic premise of what was policy in the military until, I believe, the Obama administration. And today, of course, gays are allowed to serve openly in the United States military. But at that time in the 90s, they were not. mean, they could, but they could not be open about it. And that's what Don't Ask, Don't Tell is. Questions? So one of the questions is, why was the government so hung up on the idea of homosexuals in the military? Well, the thing you got to understand is in the 90s, people were still kind of afraid of gay people, in the sense that it was not something that was totally mainstream yet. Today, I think people understand much more about the LGBTQ community than they did in the 90s. I remember in particular on the TV show Ellen, before Ellen had her talk show, that she came out as gay openly in one of the episodes, and the show got shut down. People in the 90s were not really on board with that kind of thing yet. It was growing, but the movement itself wasn't that powerful yet. So I think the big issue in the military was that they were concerned not only about the cultural ramifications of it, but also about the discipline ramifications, because males were with males in the bunks and females were with females in the barracks. And I'm assuming that they thought that there would be a breakdown in discipline. I know that there are military commanders even today that's what they've ultimately said, is they don't approve of gays in the military because it breaks down discipline, and then people start dating, and then their commitment isn't to the mission, it's to each other. And I mean, there's 100 different excuses you can add in there. Whether you believe them or don't believe them is up to you. But I think that's primarily the reason why so many commanders and upper level guys had issues with it. And it's different. There's always people that are going to be, against something that's different, that's unorthodox, that's out of the normal for the traditional group. So one of the questions is, what's your personal stance on people who are LGBTQ? My stance is you can do whatever you want to do, right? If you're gay, be gay, right? If you like girls, if you like men, if you like girls, if you like whatever, I mean, as long as it's within legal limits, right? As long as you're consenting adults, I don't have a problem with it. To me, it's not, it's not my issue. It's for them, it's about, their choices, what they do with their life. So yeah, I mean, I'm probably not the best person because I'm a liberal college professor, right? But that's my position in particular. I think that people have a right to fall in love with, regardless of who you want to fall in love with. As long as you're consenting adults and as long as you're of age, it's up to you. Other questions? Okay. So the next part is going to take a look at the economy, as far as the Clinton administration. The 90s were an era where the economy ran pretty smoothly. It did very well for much of the 90s. And a lot of this was because of the dot-com boom, as it was referred to. The internet becomes big business during the 1990s. This is where you began to see AOL. It's where you began to see, Netscape. You began to see these companies that began to set up. Microsoft became huge in the 1990s. And personal computers were a part of this technology. So it's kind of a mix of both. You had the personal computer, which started to become smaller and much easier to sell to people. I remember the first major computer that I ever had was a Gateway 2000. And most of y'all are probably going to be like, a Gateway 2000, what the heck is that? I wonder if I can even find one. Stand by, I'm going to see if I can actually find one on the internet here. This show will look at this and be like, this was tiny. There it is. Yeah, that was my old computer right there. That was a Gateway 2000, right, with Windows 95. And you basically look at it and go, what? Right? They were huge. Well, compared to previous editions, they were actually quite small. So the advantage of the Gateway, as compared to some of the other ones, and then eventually Dell became big. I think Dell was after Gateway, and then there were some other companies that were mixed in there too. But I think the advantage of that is basically that The computers had become smaller so that they were easier to fit. They weren't the size of a room anymore. In the 50s and 60s, there were computers. In fact, the first computers had been set up in World War II for not missile defense, but aircraft defense. They were there to shoot down Nazi aircraft if they ever invaded the United States. And they were huge. I mean, they were gigantic because the processors alone were the size of a room. With the invention of the microprocessor, which I believe was in the 80s, that began a trend towards smaller computers. And of course, most of y'all have got, tablets and cell phones that are, dinky as compared to what these original ones were. I can tell you that the Gateway 2000 that I originally bought, that computer as compared to what I have today, right, which isn't even a high level gaming PC, the computer I have today has 2,000 times more processing power. That's how far just in y'all's lifetime that we've come. So where are we going to be in 20, 30 years? It's an amazing conversation. Who knows? Especially as, electronic devices get smaller and more powerful. I mean, in the 1990s, nobody would have ever guessed that your cell phone would do all of these things, and it would tell you the weather and play music and, all this stuff. All of those would just be amazing to somebody from the 1990s. So it was a very different decade in that regard. So basically how this plays into what's going on, the dot-com boom, with the internet becoming more commonplace in American homes. I think, 50% by the end of the 90s are hooked up to the internet, or maybe even more. You're starting to see that all of these online businesses become feasible. This is where Amazon begins. This is where companies like Yahoo, Google, that today are big business, but at the time were just startups. And a lot of these were in San Francisco, what we know as Silicon Valley. And these tech industries started, booming. They started, putting out product. Microsoft, as we talked about before, became a huge business with their Windows platform. And today, I think now Apple and Windows are kind of 50-50 because of devices. But, for years, there was only Windows. Now there was Macintosh, and a lot of you are probably, well, I had an Apple. I never bought Macs because I thought they were garbage. I'm not an Apple fan. I don't use a lot of Apples simply because, Apples just don't work super well, at least not for me anyway, because, it's a closed system and you have to have special tools to operate on them and all that kind of stuff. So it was mostly, I remember the Gateway 2000. I remember Windows. Those were the things that were really big, especially growing up in the 90s. And so part of that is why the economy did as well as it did. In addition, we're going to see that there's going to be NAFTA, which is going to play a role in the economy as well. That Americans had looked at NAFTA as a way to create better relations with Canada and Mexico, and to a degree it did. But it also ended up resulting in lots of American jobs going to Mexico in particular because the labor laws were less stringent and it was easier to do business there. So a lot of people blame Clinton for that, but the reality is it was actually Bush. If you remember back to last week, it was largely the Republicans that passed NAFTA, and then it kind of ended up blowing up in their face. So yeah, Clinton gets credit for it, but reality is it was actually HW who was responsible for putting that into play. And so, yeah, they hope that it would create a better relationship, in particular during the early 90s, that maybe it would create a better relationship with Mexico that would decrease the importation of drugs and illegal immigrants. And whether or not it had that effect, I'm going to say probably not. But people began by the 90s to become aware of the fact that we have a drug problem, and that drug problem is not only in the United States, but also elsewhere. And that, drugs are coming into our borders from a variety of different locations. And so the drug war becomes a big deal. I believe it was George H.W. who had made the comment, winners don't do drugs, right? Well, that was largely because the problem was becoming more severe. In the 80s, cocaine was a huge drug. And as we get into the 90s, you're starting to see meth. You're starting to see a lot of other drugs that are starting to emerge that are more domestic drugs. And so the war on drugs becomes a very real thing in the 90s. And certainly as we get into the 90s and into the 2000s, and even today, we're still dealing with that legacy in the war on drugs. Border Patrol is almost always hiring. The DEA obviously is much larger than it ever was in the 70s and 80s. And you got to remember, in the 70s and 80s, the DEA was just busting people that had weed. And so as far as like the amount of money that was invested into the DEA was like almost nothing. And then of course, once the cocaine boom hit in the 80s and people were literally ODing in the streets and that kind of stuff, that's when they realized that we've got a serious problem here. And, the budgets for a lot of these federal agencies became, scaffolded. They became much larger than what they were before. So yeah, the war on drugs, really something that begins in I would say more the 80s and then really continues into the 90s with the Clinton administration as the choices begin to diversify and as Clinton begins to get tougher with various kinds of legislation. Clinton also passed a ban on assault weapons. That ban has some wide-ranging ramifications. There are certain guns that are not available for import in the United States because they're part of that assault weapon ban. I believe the NRA has overturned a lot of them, but laws for example, short barrel rifles, which I think was passed by HW. Those were all examples of laws that the Clinton administration either continued or put into play so that they could continue the process of what they believed was the best way to keep guns off the streets. They kind of approached it differently than other administrations did. Clinton believed that keeping the assault weapons off the streets will keep everybody in a situation where people will be safer. Whether you believe that or not, that's ultimately up to you. I know we live in Texas, and Texas is pretty big on owning 15 AR-15s, but the Clinton administration kind of took an opposite position. Other aspects, healthcare. One of the other issues of the 90s that they tried to address was creating a healthcare system that would allow people to have better access to it. Most of y'all are familiar with the healthcare system and the fact that it is fundamentally broken. And it is extraordinarily expensive for even the most basic operations. And so that creates a pretty big problem for people that are in need. I think in the United States, even today, that most people go without health insurance. And it's just because of the fact that it's so expensive. It's just too hard for most Americans to get it. Or if they have pre-existing conditions, very few insurance companies are willing to cover them. Obamacare comes in later, right? And whether or not it's a success or not is up to y'all. But this was before this. And in the 90s, Clinton had put his wife in charge of a task force to try to look into some kind of idea. How can we make healthcare more affordable for the average American? So what they did was create caps on Medicare and Medicaid reimbursements. They reorganized Americans into large health blocks, which is essentially the basic goal of Obamacare. So what Obamacare did was kind of take what Clinton and Truman and others had already tried to do and consolidated them. And try to move it forward into a more reasonable package. And the fees for service were put into these by tobacco taxes. Tobacco companies were taxed into oblivion. And for those of you that smoke, that if even just 10 years ago or 20 years ago, that pack of cigarettes has gone up dramatically. To the part where cartons of cigarettes are almost unaffordable anymore because they become so expensive. So all of that are supposed to fund the legislative costs that would go into making the program. The problem with the Clintons' healthcare reform bill was that lobbying interests were essentially there to stop it from happening. The Clintons had to back down because they put themselves at risk for being reelected in 1996. They knew that might not happen without those lobby groups behind it. And the same thing happened largely with Obamacare. There's a lot of big insurance companies and others that did not like Obamacare and lobbied very strongly to keep it out. And so the Obamacare that we ended up with was a neutered version of what the original one would have looked like. And that's largely because there are powerful lobbying groups, especially insurance companies, that make a lot of money off of you. Just think about the amount of money that you pay in car insurance a month, and then think about your homeowner's insurance, and think about your life insurance. You have insurance on everything. You probably have insurance on insurance, mortgage insurance, right? I mean, you're paying thousands of dollars probably conceivably a month just in insurance. So those companies make a lot of money, and they don't want to see that, get bitten into by some government agency. And so a lot of that, I think, is why Clinton wasn't able to really do anything significant when it came to healthcare reform. Obamacare would later pick up the torch, but that's going to be, 20 years into the future before Americans would be ready for it. So because of the failure, I think, particularly with healthcare, but also some of the other issues, Republicans made up some ground in 1994, in particular what was known as the Contract with America. One of the most outspoken critics of the Clinton administration was a guy by the name of Newt Gingrich, who at the time was Speaker of the House. And he was able to lobby and to rally the Republicans to some big gains in 94 through what was called the Contract with America, a kind of rightward shift in politics. And I tended to look at Clinton as kind of a middle ground candidate. I don't really think that Clinton was the hardcore liberal that Gingrich and others had criticized him as, but they painted him as such. And kind of using Clinton as a boogeyman, they were able to get a lot of Republican seats in 94. So it was a Republican dominated government in 1994. The problem with having a Democratic president and a Republican government is that they don't always, see eye to eye. I tend to think that Clinton worked fairly well with the Republicans, better than what some other presidents have done. But this is part of what happens in 94 as we begin to see the Republicans are going to gain ground back, particularly because of the failure of the healthcare reform and some of the other things that happen. Any questions? Okay. All right, so let's talk about Clinton going into his second term. The Republicans gained ground in 94, but that didn't necessarily translate to a presidential victory. In particular, in 1996, Clinton will run again against the Republican challenger by the name of Robert or Bob Dole, a senator from Kansas. Now, the thing I remember most about Bob Dole was Bob Dole used to always refer to himself as Bob Dole. He always referred to himself in the third person, and it was really weird. So he would give these campaign speeches and he would say, Bob Dole isn't going to let the interests in Washington dominate the average person, and Main Street will prevail over Pennsylvania Avenue, and Bob Dole is going to make sure that Americans are looked after. And the whole time you're just sitting there looking to yourself, you're just like, huh? Like, why does he keep referring to himself in the third person? Like, it's just weird. Can you imagine me saying, and Rob Raymaker is an important, teacher who's looking out for your interests. And Rob Raymaker wants to make sure that you get everything out of this class that you physically can't. It just sounds weird. I don't know if referring to himself in the third person is what failed to get him elected. I think it was that he was a poor campaigner and that his issues were kind of out of whack with what Americans wanted in 1996. But in 96, Dole does not seriously challenge Clinton. And I think the big issue at stake is the economy. James Carville, who was the advisor for the Clinton campaign, essentially gave a really famous speech. And what he basically said was, it's the economy, stupid. The Americans were doing well. The dot-com boom was in place. Businesses like Walmart were hiring by the droves. There was large expansion in the retail sector. Shopping malls were being opened all over the United States. So to Americans, it appeared that things were going really, really well, at least certainly much better than they were in the 70s. So because of that, Americans voted for Clinton because they saw Clinton essentially as the direction that they wanted to go in. And so regardless of the scandals, regardless of a lot of other things that we're going to be talking about on Wednesday, there were things that were going on behind the scenes. But Americans, I think, didn't really care because the economy was doing well. As long as I got a job and as long as I'm doing well and as long as the country's doing well, who cares what the president does in his private time? And so in 96, Clinton wins pretty astoundingly. And so he wins his second term as president of the United States. So I would say that as far as the domestic side of Bill Clinton, I would look at what does he do? Why is he important? Clinton has tax cuts, which was definitely a conservative issue, but Clinton kind of bows down to it. He slashes the capital gains tax. He does measures that benefit the wealthy, but by the same token, he has caps on Medicare, tax credits for children. He increases the size of the military, and ultimately he has an assault weapons ban. So I would say that Clinton goes both ways. I think that as far as, Democrat and Republican, I wouldn't really say that he's a super liberal president. I'm not going to say that he's a super conservative president. He tends to kind of, Clinton kind of was a good politician that he could understand which way the wind was blowing, and then he would promptly change his stance to that. And so in that regard, he's no different than really any other politician that America's ultimately had. One last thing I will talk about as far as Clinton's domestic package is smoking. Smoking became under fire, especially as we get into the mid and late 90s, as families of smokers began to sue, Philip Reynolds, and some of the other larger cigarette companies for their deaths. And in 1998, a settlement was reached where the tobacco firms had to pay $50 billion in damages. And some of that came from the federal government. Surprisingly, these people had filed suits and the federal government piggybacked off of it. The government sued these large ones too, like the I think Philip Reynolds, is that the name of the company? And some of the other companies as well. And the reason for this was because of healthcare costs. All these people had smoked, and so the government had to pick up the tab. All these people that had surgeries and stuff who went on Medicare and Medicaid, they ultimately were charging the federal government because those are government programs. So they sued the tobacco companies for that, and they won a very large settlement. And so what this did was it forced the creation of labels on all of the cigarettes that you buy today. They'll have a label on them that says that cigarettes are hazardous to your health and that smoking these are basically going to kill you. And so every cigarette that you get, it has to have those labels on them. In addition, we're going to see that the tobacco lobby largely comes crashing down. Today, big tobacco isn't nearly as powerful as it was 20, 30 years ago. And so there have been ad campaigns that have targeted them specifically. There have been evidence that has circulated throughout Congress where they found out that tobacco companies knew that their product was addictive and they continued selling it anyway, and that essentially tobacco was worse than most drugs. There were studies that showed that tobacco was more addictive than weed, and weed was illegal, right? And tobacco wasn't. So there were issues at play that were much larger than just the suits. And so even today, I think we're still looking at a tobacco lobby that's been greatly diminished by the lawsuits during the Clinton administration, particularly in the 1990s. Of course, today I think it's what vaping and people are trying to do all kinds of other stuff to prevent smoking in the first place. But today, as of 2021, there are fewer smokers on the planet than there ever were before. Certainly since I've been alive in 1985. So, and that's largely because of these campaigns and because of the government and because of the pressure that were put on these agencies. There was a law passed, for example, that said that they couldn't advertise in children's magazines. They, were restricted from advertising at certain parts. And in a lot of ways, smokers are probably more persecuted than alcohol users or any of the other drugs that are allowed in the United States. And that, I think, largely begins as a result of the Clinton administration. Questions? So what's the ultimate legacy of this? To finish up, Clinton is known as the first postmodern president. And what we mean by that is a president who is simultaneously right and left depending on the prevailing political mood. Long gone are the days where George Washington is, a federalist, even though he really wasn't, but he is a federalist. And these are the positions that I'm going to stand on, and I'm going to stand on them until, hell freezes over. That's not what modern politicians do. One of the big complaints that people talk about significantly is, oh, my senator or my congressman changes regularly. Well, that's what they do. That's postmodernism. In the modern political environment with a 24 hours news cycle, you always want to make sure that you're on the right side of the coin. You always want to make sure that whatever way the breeze is blowing, that you're in the right position. And that's largely Clinton, right? That's why they called him Slick Willie, all right? Because he would change his positions. He was a good compromise candidate between Republicans and Democrats. And I think represented the 90s as a whole. People were less hardline. They were less severe about their parties and what they were doing in the 90s. And so I think Clinton kind of reflects that, being both right and left, and his policies, I think, reflect that as well. So you're going to see that with a lot of future presidents. It's not a unique situation. Presidents, as I think, what did W call it? And when the Kerry election, flip-flopping, right? As though it's like a negative thing, but a smart politician knows what the issues are. They know what their constituents want, and they make sure that they're situated in a position to give it to their constituents. Because the moment that you don't is the moment that you're no longer going to be a politician in the United States. Clinton also is responsible for race dialogues, in particular during the Rodney King incident, which takes place. The Clinton administration essentially tries to get involved in, essentially, race dialogues and understanding, getting people to understand the kinds of things that we realize today, that, for example, African Americans get paid less than white people, that, Hispanics have a difficult time finding jobs, more difficult than, for example, your traditional white person would, right? Things that in the 90s, nobody believed. They didn't think it was real. But today, of course, we understand that those are very real political issues that affect people even to this day. Statistically, the jail populations, all of those things were issues that Americans were starting to come to grips with in the 1990s. And lastly, Clinton appoints, minorities to his cabinet. He appoints minorities to various positions, to judgeships, that kind of thing, that hadn't been done on a regular basis before. And so we begin to see a Congress as of the 1990s that is more inclusive. Certainly, it's still not great. It's still the old white people's club. But we see more people, for example, that are African American. We're seeing more Hispanic senators. We're seeing Muslim senators. We're seeing people from Polynesia, right? We're seeing people from other places much more so now than what we ever did before. And so part of that, I would say, begins to happen during the Clinton years. Clinton appoints people to positions, but also we see that the electorate is changing as well. It's becoming more diverse. And we're beginning to see that reflected in the peoples that are being elected to Congress. Questions on the Clinton administration and its significance as far as the domestic policies? So one of the questions is, was global warming a serious issue in the 90s? I think it started to become aware of it. You can argue even today whether it is or isn't, and there's, climate change deniers, and there's, people on both sides that are going to say this or that. But I would say in the 90s that the evidence started emerging that this kind of stuff was happening. You started to see more severe storms. I think it really began with Hurricane Andrew in 94, 93, 94. Hurricane Andrew was one of the worst hurricanes in American history. It was a Category 5, and although it didn't do as much destruction as, for example, the one that hit New Orleans, Katrina, it was one of the highest recorded winds ever. And people started looking into this meteorologically, and they understood that, things are happening, that currents are changing, that, temperatures are changing. They began to encounter the idea that, mass extinctions were taking place as far as animals were concerned. And so all of these, I think, were part of where people were starting to come to grips with the science, but I don't know if it was necessarily there yet, as far as the average person believing it. But it was happening. All of these things, I think, were starting to evolve in the 90s. All right, guys. So Wednesday, we're going to be taking a look at the foreign policy of the Clinton administration. So we'll take a look at Black Hawk Down. We'll take a look at what essentially takes place in Bosnia, the end of the Cold War, as far as the final issues with the emergence of the Soviet Union, falling apart and then becoming the country of Russia, the Yeltsin-Clinton relationship. And then Friday, we'll largely finish up with the scandals of the Clinton years. We'll take a look at its overall legacy. And so that's essentially what's on tap for this week. So hope that y'all have a wonderful, wonderful Monday, and I will see you next time. Take care.